She was digging through trash in the rain until he saw the necklace he gave 9 years ago, on the neck of a child who looked just like him. It started on a rainy afternoon in Willow Creek, a small Kentucky town where secrets settled like dust on forgotten bookshelves. Andrew Blake hadn't planned on staying. He was just passing through, running from a past paved in concrete towers and corporate meetings, a life he no longer recognized. But then he saw her. Rachel Moore stood in the drizzle, clutching a broken umbrella, her arms protectively around 3 children as they sorted through a soggy cardboard box behind a fading bookstore. The youngest girl, no more than 5, wore a necklace Andrew hadn't seen in nearly a decade, one he had once given to Rachel on the night she disappeared. For a moment, time cracked open. His heart, long trained to stay quiet, lurched with recognition and doubt. Were they hers? Were they his? He didn't know. All he knew was that he couldn't keep driving. Not this time. Not when a ghost from his past had eyes, a voice, and maybe even his smile. And so Andrew Blake parked his car and stayed. The rain came down in fine needles, slicing the soft gray light that settled over Willow Creek, a quiet Kentucky town most people forgot to remember. Andrew Blake stepped out of his black sedan, the door hissing shut behind him like the punctuation mark on a life he no longer wanted. He didn't open an umbrella. The rain soaked into his suit, slowly seeping past his collar, trailing down the back of his neck. But he didn't flinch. For a man who once negotiated billion-dollar mergers under stadium lights, the silence of this forgotten street hit harder than any boardroom war. He had no reason to stop here, or at least that's what he told himself when the GPS rerouted through town. But something made him pull over. Across the road near the rusted side of a once blue bookstore, he saw her, Rachel Moore. She hadn't changed much. A little thinner, maybe shadows under her eyes deeper, but she was unmistakable. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks, soaked from the rain, as she bent over a cardboard box with 3 small children huddled close. One was digging for what looked like old school supplies. Another clutched a wet backpack to her chest. The smallest girl, maybe 5 years old, was perched on a crate, legs swinging, rain dripping from the ends of her curls. And around her neck was a necklace. His necklace. A thin silver chain with a tiny locket shaped like a crescent moon, something he had given Rachel the night she said goodbye, the night she left without explanation and never returned. The child wore it casually, as if it had always belonged to her. Andrew felt his lungs tighten. His heart, dulled by years of polite disinterest, now beat like it remembered something his mind hadn't caught up to. Was it possible? Could all of them be his? A car honked behind him, and he blinked, stepping onto the curb, half aware of the water pooling in his shoes. Rachel looked up then. Their eyes locked for the first time in 9 years. Her face didn't soften. If anything, she seemed to flinch, as if seeing him stung. Andrew opened his mouth, but nothing came. The only sound was the rain, steady, cold, relentless, just like the guilt he'd carried without knowing why. Andrew's shoes crunched against the gravel as he crossed the narrow road, each step dragging like it weighed more than it should. The bookstore looked like it hadn't seen a customer in months, its hand-painted sign, chipped windows fogged with time, and a crooked open plaque swinging in the breeze. But it wasn't the store that caught his attention. It was the woman kneeling just behind it, under the leaking eave of a rusted gutter, trying to shield 3 children with a broken umbrella while they sorted through a damp pile of discarded boxes and torn magazines. The umbrella was torn at the edges. One rib snapped clean in half, and she had to angle it carefully to keep the rain off the youngest girl's head. Her free hand moved swiftly, brushing aside wet newspapers and molding plastic bags, searching what for notebooks, school supplies, food. Andrew didn't know. He only knew that no woman should have to do this. And then he saw her face again. Rachel. Her name punched through his chest like a wind he wasn't ready for. She looked older, yes, tired in a way that makeup could never hide, but there was still a fierceness in the way she crouched, a mother's armor built from years of sacrifice. One child beside her, a girl with dark braids, was clutching a faded workbook to her chest. The boy, slightly older, held a torn astronomy magazine like it was sacred. The smallest girl, the one with the necklace, was humming to herself as she stacked bottle caps into a tower on top of an overturned milk crate. Rachel murmured something to them, quiet and urgent, likely reminding them not to stray too far or touch anything sharp. The children obeyed without question. No whining, no complaining. Just silent, focused effort, as if they'd done this 100 times before. And all the while, Rachel kept that broken umbrella tilted over them, not herself. Rain streaked down her back, darkening her sweater, soaking her jeans, but she didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply shielded them with the last thing she had. Andrew swallowed hard. He didn't know if he was witnessing heartbreak or courage, or maybe both folded into the same moment. All he knew was that he couldn't look away. He wasn't sure how long he stood there, frozen beneath the gray sky, rain soaking through his tailored coat, before the truth landed like a thunderclap in his chest. Rachel Moore. The name alone unraveled something in him, something he had spent 9 years neatly folding away behind board meetings, penthouse views, and champagne smiles. 9 years since she had vanished from his life without a word, without a trace. 9 years since she had stood in his apartment doorway with trembling hands, whispering that she had to go, that it was better this way, that he would understand someday. He hadn't understood. Not then. Not now. And yet here she was, in a small Kentucky town he had never heard of until today, crouched behind a rundown bookstore, shielding 3 children with nothing but her spine and a broken umbrella. She hadn't seen him yet. He could have turned away, could have walked back to his car and driven off before memory did its damage, but something inside him refused him. The past wasn't just calling, it was standing 10 feet away, holding bottle caps and baby books and possibly his entire future. He took a step forward, then another, his shoes squelching against the soaked gravel. Rachel glanced up and everything stopped. Her eyes locked onto his, like twin anchors pulling him under. For a breathless moment, neither of them moved. He expected surprise, maybe even joy. But her face hardened instead. A flicker of something, panic, sorrow, fury, passed through her expression so fast it nearly undid him. She stood slowly, placing a steady hand on the boy's shoulder, as if shielding him from something she couldn't name. Andrew opened his mouth, but the words caught. There was too much. Too many questions. Too many memories. Too many nights he'd asked himself why she left without goodbye. He had convinced himself she didn't love him, that she had chosen another life. But seeing her here like this made every tidy excuse he'd built crumble. She wasn't just an old lover. She was a mother. She was surviving. And the necklace the little girl wore, the one Andrew had given Rachel on their final night, now hung around a child's neck like a question he wasn't ready to answer. Andrew's gaze dropped from Rachel's face to the smallest child sitting on the overturned milk crate, her legs swinging gently as she hummed to herself, completely unaware of the storm unraveling just a few feet away. Something shimmered faintly against her chest, a small, delicate chain that caught what little gray light filtered through the clouds. And then his breath stopped. Hanging from her neck, resting against a threadbare shirt, was a silver crescent moon locket, its surface slightly dulled by time but unmistakable. He knew that necklace. He had chosen it himself, on a rainy night in New York, walked into that little boutique off Mercer Street because Rachel had once told him she loved the moon more than the sun, because the moon stays even when everything else disappears. He had given it to her the night she left. No explanation, no argument, just a parting gift wrapped in trembling hands, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, she'd come back. But she never did. And now here it was around the neck of a girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, her features a delicate blend of mystery and memory. Her eyes, though, cast downward in concentration as she arranged colored bottle caps into a perfect spiral, held the shape of Rachel's. But there was something else in her expression, something that struck him like a mirror he didn't know he was holding up to himself. The way her brows furrowed when she focused, the shape of her jaw, even the tilt of her head as she sorted red caps from blue. He had done the same thing as a child, grouping puzzle pieces, not by edge, but by color. It was impossible. It had to be. And yet the necklace told a different story, one etched not in speculation, but in cold silver and memory. That locket didn't just belong to Rachel, it was a piece of their past. And now it was part of this child's present. Andrew felt dizzy, unmoored, as if the rain had pulled back the veil on a truth too heavy to carry. He wasn't just looking at a stranger's daughter. He might be staring at his own. The wind shifted slightly, rustling the edge of Rachel's soaked sweater, carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and something achingly familiar, like childhood summers, or the lingering trace of her perfume, long vanished from his memory, but now rising from the shadows as if time itself had circled back. Andrew took another slow step forward, barely feeling the rain as it slid down his collar, as though his entire body had gone numb, except for the thunder pounding in his chest. His eyes stayed locked on the little girl with the necklace, watching as she lined up the bottle caps with a strange kind of precision, stacking them in color gradients that made no sense to anyone else but made perfect sense to him. He had done the same as a boy when the world felt too loud. He had sought order in the chaos. He had used patterns to breathe. She was so quiet, so self-contained, as if she lived half in her own world and only dipped a toe into everyone else's. But there was something more than resemblance now. It was something deeper, unspoken, some invisible thread pulling taut between his past and the present, stretching across the lost years with unbearable weight. Andrew glanced back at Rachel, who was no longer looking at him, but at the girl, her face tense with a kind of love he hadn't yet known how to give. And in that moment, he didn't see just a former lover trying to survive. He saw a mother protecting her child with the same fierceness Rachel had once used to protect him from his own demons. The girl turned slightly, and the silver crescent locket caught the light once more, glinting like a signal from the past one he could no longer ignore. Andrew felt the air leave his lungs. His voice came out in a whisper, barely audible over the rain and the sound of tires hissing in the distance, but the words slipped through his lips before he could stop them, raw and unfiltered, as if dredged up from a part of him he had sealed off long ago. Could she be my daughter? The question shattered something inside him, and in that one breathless moment, Andrew Blake's entire world tilted on its axis. Andrew stood frozen for what felt like hours, even though only seconds passed. The weight of the question he'd just whispered clung to him like the rain soaking through his expensive coat. Rachel didn't look up at first. She was crouched low beside the children, adjusting the youngest boy's coat, brushing damp curls from his forehead with a tenderness that twisted something sharp inside Andrew's chest. He took a step forward, water splashing around his shoes, and cleared his throat as if that could summon courage. "Rachel," he said, his voice uncertain but steady enough to carry over the patter of rain. Her head jerked up, eyes locking onto his with something that looked like recognition, followed by something colder. Resolve. "You shouldn't be here," she said flatly, standing up quickly and shielding the children instinctively, her body forming a subtle barrier. "I didn't even know you were still." He trailed off, unsure how to phrase a sentence that had waited 9 years to be said. Rachel cut him off with a glance that told him this wasn't the time for explanations or apologies. "Whatever you think this is, it's not. Just go." Her words were measured but heavy with a practiced sharpness, the kind people use when they've had to protect something fragile for far too long. "Rachel, please. Just let me talk to you," he said, taking another step forward, his hand half raised like he wanted to reach for her but didn't dare. She shook her head, her lips pressed into a tight line. "You don't get to show up after 9 years and talk," she said, eyes flicking toward the children who were now staring silently, sensing something tense but not quite understanding it. "Whatever closure you're looking for, it's not here." He opened his mouth again, but she turned away, gathering the children close. The little girl with the locket looked up at him, her eyes curious but cautious, and then buried her face in Rachel's coat. "Rachel, I need to know," he said, voice cracking now. "Just tell me, is she—" "It doesn't matter," Rachel snapped, spinning around to face him. "You had your chance to matter. Now leave us alone." With that, she turned and walked away, her silhouette disappearing into the rain, her children flanking her like a quiet, wary guard. Andrew stood alone in the alley, surrounded by wet cardboard, and the ghost of what could have been his question still echoing silently between the raindrops. He remembered the first week after they broke up as a blur of regret and impulse, the kind that makes a man pace the floor at midnight with a phone in his hand and no idea what words will make things right. Andrew had messaged Rachel dozens of times, texts, calls, voicemails, some angry, some apologetic, most desperate. At first, he thought she was just hurt, buying time, cooling off. He believed naively that love would override pride, and that she'd eventually answer. But the silence stretched thick and unnerving, and every day that passed without a reply only made the air tighter in his chest. He emailed her one night at 2 a.m. with the subject line, "Please don't shut me out." It bounced back within seconds, undeliverable. His heart sank. He checked her social media. Gone. Every trace of her was scrubbed clean. He even went back to the bookstore where they first met, asking a trembling college student if Rachel still worked there, only to receive a blank look and a polite shake of the head. Something was wrong. And then came the moment, 3 weeks after the breakup, when he barged into his father's office and demanded to know if he had anything to do with Rachel disappearing from his life. Blake Sr. barely looked up from his scotch. "You're young. You'll get over it," he said, like love was a rash, like Rachel was a mistake best removed cleanly. Andrew's blood boiled. "Did you block her? Did you have her blacklisted, or—" His father finally looked at him. Not angry, just disappointed. "I did what was necessary. That girl was a distraction, a liability. She would have destroyed everything you've worked for." Andrew stormed out that day, but the damage was already done. What he didn't know until months later, long after he had stopped calling, was that his personal assistant, Lauren, had been following direct orders from Blake Sr. to intercept and delete any communication tied to Rachel Moore. Voicemails erased, emails filtered and buried. Even a handwritten letter he tried to send never made it past the mailroom. She had been erased from his world with surgical precision, leaving him to believe she had simply walked away. And by the time he realized the truth, it was too late. She was gone. Off the grid, unreachable. Now standing in the rain, staring at her retreating figure and the child who might bear his blood, Andrew finally understood she hadn't abandoned him. She had been erased, and he had let it happen. In the days that followed, Andrew found himself unable to focus on anything except the image of Rachel's soaked coat disappearing into the mist and the haunting locket around that little girl's neck. His instincts, sharpened by years of corporate warfare, kicked in, not for conquest this time, but for clarity. He needed to know the truth not only about Rachel, but about the children. He began watching quietly from the tinted windows of his parked car, or the shadowed corners of alleyways, observing the rhythm of their lives like a stranger trying to read a language he once knew. The little girl Sophie was always the first to catch his eye. She had Rachel's stubborn jaw and the same way of squinting into sunlight like it had offended her. She was protective, alert, fiercely attentive to the younger ones. Maisie, a wide-eyed toddler with curls like a cloud and a soft smile that made Andrew's chest ache, and Eli, the middle child, thin and quiet, who always walked a step behind with a worn book clutched to his chest. They didn't go to a regular school. Instead, Rachel walked them to a small community center where a woman named Denise ran informal literacy classes and served day-old bread and peanut butter to kids whose parents couldn't afford much else. Andrew noted that Sophie often stayed behind after the others had left, cleaning up crumbs, wiping the table, helping Denise with chairs. Eli read aloud in the corner with a gentleness that didn't match his worn clothes, and Maisie, ever the explorer, tried to teach herself ballet by watching YouTube videos on a donated phone with a cracked screen. It was like watching a world unfold that shouldn't exist, a life Rachel had built with nothing but her hands and willpower, a life where dignity lived beside hardship. Andrew felt both admiration and guilt clawing at him with equal ferocity. He followed them to a shelter one night, watched from the car as they climbed 3 flights to a temporary housing room with a broken window and duct tape over the lock. He saw Rachel carry Maisie half asleep, her own shoulders hunched with exhaustion. She never looked up, never sensed him. Or maybe she did and didn't care. Each observation chipped away at the polished life Andrew had built, boardrooms, mergers, headlines, until it all felt hollow. These children weren't part of his world, but they had become his orbit. They were living proof of a life stolen by silence, orchestrated by power, and now quietly surviving despite it. Andrew didn't know what he'd do next. But one thing had become clear. This wasn't just about Rachel anymore. It was about the 3 children whose names now lived in his thoughts like prayers, Sophie, Eli, and Maisie. He hadn't meant for her to see him. Not yet. Not when all he had was questions and guilt and the unbearable weight of too many what-ifs pressing against his ribs. But that evening, as the sun dipped below the rooftops of Willow Creek and the children had just finished their lessons at the community center, Andrew lingered too long at the edge of the lot, half-shadowed behind the rusty frame of a chain-link fence. Sophie had gone ahead with Eli and Maisie in tow, chattering softly, leaving Rachel a few steps behind, her bag slung over one shoulder, her hair pulled up in that same hurried way he remembered. She paused suddenly, her body going still. Then slowly, deliberately, she turned her head and looked straight at him. No hesitation, no surprise, just quiet fury that simmered behind tired eyes. He stepped forward instinctively like a man approaching a cliff's edge and opened his mouth, but the words collapsed under the weight of her stare. "Rachel," he managed, voice rough. But she cut him off with a single sharp breath, her hand tightening around the strap of her bag as she closed the distance between them. "No," she said softly but firmly. "You don't get to say my name like that. Not anymore." He stood frozen, absorbing her presence like a blow to the chest. Up close, she looked older, stronger, the kind of woman who had built resilience from rubble. There were lines around her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a hardness in her voice that years ago had been laughter. "You left," she said, her voice tight, low, controlled. "I didn't," he said quickly, desperately. "I tried. I searched for you. I called. But again she shook her head, her expression unreadable. "You came 9 years too late, Andrew. Do you understand what that means?" Her voice cracked, but her eyes didn't blink. 9 years of scraped knees and hospital bills and nights I had to choose between dinner and heat. 9 years of answering questions I couldn't explain, of watching them look for someone I couldn't name. He opened his mouth again, but no sound came. "You're not a villain in my story," she said, quieter now, "but you're not the hero either. You don't get to walk back in and rewrite it because you finally feel something." She turned to leave, but then paused. Her next words came like a blade, clean and final. "Don't follow us again. Don't make this harder than it already is. If you care even a little, walk away. Please. Don't cause more damage than you already have." Then she walked into the dusk, her silhouette melting into the quiet, and Andrew Blake was left alone with only the echo of her words and the unshakable knowledge that she was right. Andrew hadn't slept. Not really. His mind had been a storm of fragmented memories and unanswered questions, his heart beating a rhythm of guilt and longing he couldn't slow down. The next morning, he stood outside the modest brick building that served as the town's community learning center, waiting, not lurking, but present, purposeful, desperate to make himself known without being invasive. When Rachel arrived with the children, her steps slowed the moment she saw him. Her jaw tightened, her arm instinctively reached out to keep the youngest Maisie close to her side. He took a slow step forward, his hands open, his voice lowered not from weakness, but from the rawness of everything he hadn't said. "Rachel, please, just hear me out. Just this once. That's all I'm asking." She didn't speak, but something in her eyes wavered, tired, wary, but curious enough to let him continue. "I'm not here to claim anything. I know I lost that right the moment I let you disappear from my life. But I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about them. If I had, I would have dropped everything. I would have found you. I would have fought for them. For you." Rachel's silence was deafening. He swallowed, continued. "You can hate me if you need to. You can be furious. But don't punish them by shutting the door on someone who wants to be there for them. They deserve more than I had growing up. They deserve every bit of love this world can offer, even if it's late, even if it's flawed. I'm not perfect. God knows I'm not. But I can show up. I can help. I can be there for field trips, dentist appointments, story nights, scraped knees, piano recitals, or even just for the quiet moments in between when they need someone to listen. I'm not trying to erase the past, Rachel. I'm trying to build something in spite of it. He looked at the kids through the window. Sophie focused on a book, Eli tinkering with a Lego creation, Maisie laughing softly with another little girl. His voice trembled. Please, let me be part of their story. I don't want to be the man they only hear about in whispers. I want to earn my place not as a replacement for anyone, but as someone who loves them unconditionally. I'm here, Rachel, and I'm not walking away again. She still hadn't responded, but for the first time she didn't look like she was about to leave. Rachel's voice was quiet but razor sharp, slicing through the fragile hope that hung between them. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She simply looked at Andrew with a gaze forged from 9 years of survival. Sleepless nights, unanswered questions, and scraped together strength. They don't need someone who just shows up and disappears again. She said each word deliberate, like it had been rehearsed in her head 1,000 times but never spoken aloud until now. They need constancy. They need safety. They need someone who stays when things get hard, when the rent's late, when fevers spike at 2 a.m. When the nightmares won't stop, when I have nothing left to give and they still need breakfast and shoes and homework help. You think this is just about love, Andrew. It's not. It's about staying power. She took a breath, the tremor barely hidden beneath the surface, and folded her arms not defensively but protectively, as if holding the memories close to her chest. You left once. Maybe not by choice. Maybe not with cruelty. But you left. And I was the one who had to explain why there wasn't a father at the school play, why no one came to the hospital when Maisie broke her arm, why Sophie stopped asking if someone would walk her to the bus stop. I was the one who sat up all night whispering to Eli when he said he didn't know what boys were supposed to grow into if they had no men around. Her voice cracked, but she didn't let it break her. Don't you dare come back now wearing guilt like it's redemption. Don't think a few promises can repair what's already woven into their bones. I'm not saying you don't care. I'm not saying you're the enemy. But I'm telling you this is not a part-time job. This is not a rescue mission. This is their life. Our life. And you don't get to waltz in because you suddenly realized what you missed. She stepped closer, her eyes locked to his. So if you're going to be in their lives, Andrew, it cannot be with hesitation. It cannot be because it makes you feel better about the past. It has to be because you're willing to carry the weight of every day forward no matter how heavy it gets. Because if you leave again, even once, it won't be me who breaks. It'll be them. And I won't let that happen. Andrew stood at the edge of the community center parking lot, the worn gravel crunching beneath his polished shoes, a sound too clean, too foreign for a place like Willow Creek. The drizzle had started again, soft and cold, beating on the shoulders of his tailored coat, but he didn't move. He watched Rachel disappear through the front doors, her back rigid, her hand resting gently on Maisie's shoulder as they walked inside. The pain in his chest tightened, not with regret, but with something deeper resolve. He turned slowly, looking around at the quiet streets, the distant sound of a dog barking, the faint scent of wood smoke in the rain. This place, so far removed from the glass towers and boardrooms of his life in the city, pulsed with something he hadn't felt in years, truth. And he knew in that moment, as sure as he knew his own name, that no deal, no prestige, no billion-dollar valuation was worth more than what he'd almost lost here. That night, he didn't return to the city. He canceled his flight, sent a single message to his assistant, put everything on hold, indefinitely. Then he drove to a small inn on the edge of town and checked in under his real name. Not Andrew Blake, the CEO, but just Andrew. The receptionist looked surprised, but he didn't offer an explanation. He was done explaining. The next morning, he walked into the town's only coffee shop, ordered black coffee and eggs, and sat in a booth by the window. No phone, no laptop, just him. And he sat there again, the next day. And the next, until people started to nod at him, until the barista remembered his order, until he no longer felt like an outsider watching his own life from a distance. Later that week, he found a vacant storefront 2 blocks from the community center. Dusty windows, peeling paint. But it had potential. He stood in the middle of the empty floor and saw something more, a space where he could build something that mattered, not tech, not capital, but presence. He called his attorney not to make a move on property or launch a business, but to begin the process of legally relocating. "I'm staying," he said. "Make it permanent. Sell the condo in Manhattan. Shut down everything except what I can manage remotely, and don't let anyone talk me out of it." That evening he knocked on Rachel's door, not with answers, but with action. "I'm not here for the weekend," he said softly when she opened it. "I'm not just visiting, I'm staying. For good. If Willow Creek is where they are, then Willow Creek is where I belong. I'll trade skyscrapers for sidewalks, boardrooms for classrooms, if that's what it takes to be part of their world. I'm not going anywhere, Rachel. Not this time." The call came just after sunset, when the streetlights of Willow Creek flickered on like old memories returning to life. Andrew had just finished sweeping the floor of the small shop he'd leased that morning, an old bookstore he planned to restore partly for the community, partly for the children, and partly to prove to himself that he could build something without a boardroom. The phone in his back pocket buzzed and he almost ignored it. But something about the timing, something cold and sharp in the air, made him answer. "Father," he said quietly, already bracing himself. The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate, and lethal. So it's true. Richard Blake Sr. didn't waste words. "You're living in that town, sleeping in some backwater inn, buying up garbage properties, associating with that girl again." Andrew's jaw tightened. "Her name is Rachel, and they're my children." A long pause. Static hummed between them. Then came the voice Andrew had feared since he was 12, the voice that could burn ice. "Let me be clear, Andrew. You walk away from this life, your company, your inheritance, your name, and you are no longer my son. If you choose them, you are not a Blake. You are no one." The words sliced through him, but Andrew didn't flinch. Not this time. He walked toward the window of the shop, looking out at the quiet street where Rachel had once waited for him before prom, where Sophie had skipped across the crosswalk just yesterday, clutching a library book. "Then I guess I'm no one," he said, his voice steady. "Because I won't walk away from them. Not again." Richard laughed low and poisonous. "You're throwing away $1 billion future for a woman who gave birth in a shelter and children who will never fit our world. You are being weak, Andrew. Soft. Emotional." "No," Andrew replied, a calm fury rising in him. "I'm being human, something you stopped being the day you told your secretary to block my calls to Rachel." "You think I don't know?" The silence on the other end said everything. "You killed that relationship, not me," Andrew continued, "and now you want to do it again. But this time I won't let you." Richard's tone turned deadly. "Don't expect assent. Don't expect protection. You're cut off. And when you come crawling back, this door will be locked." Andrew's hand shook slightly, but he held the phone firm. "Then lock it. I'd rather build a door of my own with wood and sweat and the sound of my daughter's laugh behind it than walk back through yours. Goodbye, Father." And with that, he ended the call. Outside, the lights of Willow Creek glowed like quiet stars. Inside, Andrew stood taller than he ever had. The fall was swift and merciless. Within 72 hours of Andrew's refusal to abandon Rachel and the children, the empire he had once taken for granted began to unravel. His corporate accounts were frozen, his name wiped from every Blake Industries record, and the luxurious penthouse apartment he'd called home for nearly a decade was suddenly no longer his. It began with a knock on his door at dawn, a man in a tailored suit delivering legal documents with a slight bow as if apologizing for the betrayal he represented. The notice was clear. Due to a restructuring of the Blake Family Trust, Andrew's rights to all assets were revoked. His company shares were dissolved pending court review, and his access to the corporate jet credit cards and investment accounts was terminated. He stared at the papers in disbelief, not because he didn't expect this, but because of how thorough it was. Every thread of his former life had been clipped in silence. By noon, his assistant, once loyal and warm, texted him in code, "They've locked your office. HR's been given orders." "I'm sorry." By evening, his phone stopped recognizing his logins. The doorman at the Blake Tower, who once greeted him with reverence, avoided his eyes as security escorted him out like a stranger. It was raining, of course, the kind of cold Manhattan rain that made the marble steps slick and the air heavy with humiliation. Andrew stood there, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, the clothes on his back worth more than everything he now owned. No car, no driver, no golden key card, just a man in a suit with nowhere to go. Passers-by barely glanced at him, unaware that just days ago he signed deals that moved markets. Now he was just another story. He didn't call Rachel, not yet. Pride, shame, and a strange sense of relief warred within him. He had asked for this? No, he had chosen this. And though the fall burned like fire in his veins, he couldn't deny that for the first time in years, he had done something that felt real. The storm above mirrored the storm inside, and yet somewhere beneath the weight of it all, Andrew Blake, stripped of fortune and name, felt strangely free. The rain had not stopped when Andrew Blake finally made his way to Willow Creek, his shoes soaked and his once immaculate suit creased beyond recognition. The town felt like a relic from another life, small storefronts, hand-painted signs, and the kind of quiet that made you hear your own heartbeat. He passed the old bookstore, now shuttered for the evening, its windows glowing faintly from within, as if guarding some secret warmth he could no longer reach. Just around the corner, tucked behind a cafe that smelled of burnt espresso and fading hope, stood the modest Willow Hollow Inn. It wasn't much, certainly nothing compared to the penthouses and five-star suites he once took for granted, but it had a roof, and more importantly, proximity. He stepped inside, water trailing behind him onto the wooden floor, and approached the small counter where a tired woman in her 60s looked up from a crossword puzzle. Her eyes scanned him with polite curiosity, taking in the tailored coat, the heavy duffel bag, the damp hair that clung to his forehead. "Got a room upstairs," she said before he even spoke, as if she'd already decided to let him in. "Attic floor. Bit drafty, but private. Cash preferred." Andrew nodded, handing her what little he had on hand, and followed her creaky footsteps up 3 narrow flights of stairs. The room was as promised, small sloped ceiling, one window with peeling paint, a twin bed that sagged slightly in the middle, and a desk missing a drawer. But it overlooked the alley behind the bookstore, and from that dusty window, Andrew could just make out the bench where he had first seen Rachel shielding the children from the rain. He stood in silence for a long moment, the air musty with disuse, before placing his bag on the floor and sitting on the bed. The springs groaned beneath his weight. He didn't know how long he would stay or what came next, but for the first time in 9 years, he was close enough to watch, to wait, and maybe begin to understand the life he'd missed. The attic room didn't smell of wealth or power. It smelled of old wood and second chances. And Andrew, for all his losses, breathed it in like oxygen. At first, the calluses came as a surprise. Andrew Blake had never held a paintbrush for longer than a few minutes, let alone spent hours scraping flaking layers from a rotted window frame. But the quiet rhythm of physical work, the raw humility of earning sweat, became a kind of penance. It started with small tasks Ms. Carter needed. Her porch repainted. Old man Dunley couldn't wash his pickup truck anymore. The bookstore's awning had collapsed during a windstorm. Andrew offered to help, often without being asked, taking on whatever labor people would give him, in exchange for little more than enough to pay for meals and rent. He carried ladders across gravel alleys, learned to mend shingles, caulk windows, and power wash stubborn rust from forgotten gutters. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and each job stitched him more deeply into the fabric of Willow Creek. People began to take notice not just of the man who had fallen from a penthouse into their town, but of the way he showed up early, worked quietly, and never complained. One afternoon, Rachel passed by as he was retiling a broken sidewalk slab outside the bakery. She didn't stop, but she didn't turn away either. That small glance stayed with him for days. In time, Andrew rented a run-down shed behind the inn and began to convert it into a small workshop. The sign he painted himself in worn blue lettering read Blake and Willow, a name that fused his own with that of his late mother, the only person in his former life who had ever loved him without condition. The shop offered small repairs, odd jobs, and quiet dignity. He fixed broken fences, realigned doors, patched roofs, and slowly the townspeople stopped seeing him as the rich outsider and started calling him the Blake boy. There was something healing in the simplicity of it all. With each stroke of the brush and turn of a wrench, Andrew wasn't just rebuilding porches, he was rebuilding himself, No headlines, no suits, no shareholders, just scraped knuckles, honest effort, and the distant hope that one day the children who lived just a few blocks away might come to know him not as the man who left, but as the man who stayed. It began subtly like the first crack of light at dawn. Andrew never forced his presence on the children, knowing instinctively that proximity alone wasn't enough to earn back what years of absence had stolen. But one quiet evening, as he adjusted the used telescope he'd bought from a pawn shop and mounted it on the roof of the inn's storage shed, Eli wandered by silent and skeptical. The boy stood at a distance, his eyes cautious, beneath a mop of unruly brown hair, until Andrew, without turning, simply stepped aside and said, "Saturn's out tonight. You can see the rings if the clouds hold." A beat passed. Then Eli approached. One glance through the eyepiece was all it took to open a door neither of them knew had been waiting. They didn't speak much. Eli wasn't one for words, but every evening after that, if the skies were clear, the boy returned. Andrew would prepare hot cocoa in mismatched mugs, and side by side they would track constellations in silence. It was the kind of stillness that builds trust between two people who have both been let down. Maisie was different, fiery, guarded, and imaginative. She caught him sketching blueprints one day, on a napkin rough drafts for a pergola he was building for the local cafe, and scoffed at his proportions. "That arch won't hold," she muttered. He raised an eyebrow, surprised. She rolled her eyes and drew a cleaner curve, more balanced. From then on, she would wander into his workshop with her sketchpad, drawing monsters with human eyes or animals made of trees, and he began saving scraps of wood to frame her best pieces. For Sophie it was simpler, but no less significant. Her old printer jammed the night before a big paper was due, and in desperation she knocked on his shed door. "They said you fix things," she muttered. He did. 10 minutes later, the machine whirred back to life, and her paper on climate change in coastal towns began to print. She didn't thank him with words, but she returned the next day with a list of broken electronics from their apartment. One by one, Andrew repaired them. And with each repair, stargazing session and pencil sketch passed over a worn wooden bench, the once uncrossable distance between him and the three children began to shrink, not by grand gestures, but through quiet, consistent presence, the kind that says, without ever needing to say it aloud, "I'm here, and I'm not leaving again." It happened on a rainy Tuesday, the kind of gray afternoon when the clouds hung low over Willow Creek, and the scent of damp pavement clung to everything. Andrew had just finished replacing the broken hinge on the library's front gate when he saw Sophie struggling with a soggy box of school supplies outside the bookstore. Without hesitation, he rushed over, lifting the box out of her arms despite her protest. "I've got it," she snapped, but he simply smiled and carried it to the entrance. Later that evening, he surprised her with a makeshift binder organizer he had crafted from reclaimed wood, her name carved delicately into the edge, painted in soft purple. "Thought it might help," he said, placing it gently on the kitchen counter of the shared apartment where Rachel had slowly begun allowing him to stop by during the early evenings. Sophie stared at the gift, expression unreadable, then looked away without a word. Over the next week, Andrew repaired her desk lamp, brought her a second-hand copy of a rare biology book, and even helped her patch up her worn backpack. Every gesture was quiet, unspoken, and carefully respectful of her space. He never asked for thanks. But one night, as he walked Sophie home from the community center after tutoring her mother, was still at work and the streets were wet and poorly lit, he dared to speak from the hope gathering behind his ribs. "I know I can't undo the past," he said softly, "but I'd like to be there however you'll let me. Not just to fix things, to show up, every day." They had stopped beneath a flickering street lamp. Sophie turned to him slowly, the rain catching in her lashes. Her voice, when it came, was cold, calm, and carved straight from the pain of 9 silent years. "You can do a lot of things," she said, each word deliberate. "You can fix backpacks, fix lights, show up now. But that doesn't make you my father." The silence that followed was louder than any scream. She didn't wait for a response, just turned and walked the rest of the way alone. Her footsteps splashing through puddles as Andrew stood frozen under the street lamp, the glow flickering above him like a question he no longer knew how to answer. The gymnasium of Willow Creek Elementary had never felt so alive. Strings of paper lanterns swung gently from the ceiling as the scent of baked goods and old varnished wood filled the air. It was the annual fall festival, but this year had a new addition. Every student was to prepare a short presentation titled, "The Person I'm Most Proud of." The stage, usually reserved for school plays and end-of-year ceremonies, now stood beneath a bright banner painted with uneven letters by the third graders, and rows of folding chairs were quickly filled by parents, siblings, teachers, and a few curious townsfolk. Andrew sat near the back shoulders, tense heart pounding. He hadn't been invited by Rachel or the children, but he had heard about the event from Mrs. Whitaker, the retired librarian he'd helped retile her porch. He told himself he was just there to support the community. But the truth buzzed under his skin. He was waiting for something, anything from Sophie, Eli, or Maisie. One by one, students climbed the stage, some nervously fumbling with their cue cards, others speaking with animated pride about mothers, grandfathers, firemen, and neighbors. Then came Eli. He walked slowly to the microphone, one hand in his pocket, the other carrying a sheet of notebook paper. His voice was quiet, but clear. "The person I'm most proud of is my mom. She works late. She makes us pancakes even when she's tired. She always makes sure we have glue sticks for school projects. And when I'm scared of thunder, she just holds my hand and says nothing, and that makes it better." He glanced up, eyes sweeping across the crowd before lowering again. "She never gave up on us. And she never made us feel like we were too much to love." There was a soft murmur of appreciation. Rachel, sitting near the front, wiped at her eyes. Andrew closed his. It wasn't him. Of course it wasn't him. But it wasn't rejection. It was truth. And in that moment, surrounded by paper lanterns and childlike honesty, he realized that healing wasn't a title or a presentation. It was choosing to stay seated quietly and applaud with everything you had. Maisie's name was called next, and the room hushed as the small freckled girl with a halo of messy auburn curls made her way up the steps to the stage. She clutched a folded drawing in her hand, creased at the corners, its edges softened from constant handling. Andrew's breath caught as he leaned forward in his seat, instinctively gripping the sides of the chair. Maisie didn't use cue cards. She didn't carry a speech. Instead, she held up her drawing, a vibrantly colored scene of a small attic studio with an open skylight, a man with tired eyes and paint-streaked hands kneeling beside a little girl, handing her a brush. "This is my hero," she said simply. Her voice was quiet but steady, reaching the ears of every person in the room because of the depth behind each word. "He never told me I was too loud, or too messy, or too much. He didn't even know how to mix the paint at first, but he tried every day, and he stayed." She turned the drawing around to face the crowd. "His name is Andrew. He fixed our porch. He let me paint the side of his workshop. And he listens even when I'm not saying anything out loud." There was a long pause before polite claps began to echo, and Andrew, blinking rapidly, felt a tightness behind his eyes he didn't expect. Maisie returned to her seat, her eyes never meeting his, but her fingers brushed the edge of her sketchpad like a quiet thank you. Then came Eli. Shy, slow-moving Eli, who rarely spoke outside of his stargazing or whispered conversations with the old telescope Andrew had fixed up and given him. He shuffled onto the stage, a baseball cap too big for his head tucked low over his face. He didn't bring anything, just himself. "My person is someone who brought back the stars," he said, his voice barely louder than a murmur. "When my telescope broke, I thought maybe I wasn't meant to see anything beautiful again. But then someone fixed it, and sat with me, and pointed at Jupiter like it meant something." His voice cracked slightly. He didn't ask questions. He just showed up. "I don't know if he's my dad, but he's the only one who knew where to find Saturn in the dark." A hush fell over the room. Andrew lowered his head, unable to breathe for a moment. They weren't calling him Dad, but they were seeing him. And maybe that was the first step toward being worthy of the title. Finally, the room quieted once more as Sophie's name was called. For a long moment she didn't move. Then slowly, deliberately, she rose from her seat and walked toward the stage. Her steps neither hurried nor hesitant, just steady, measured, like someone approaching a truth too big to rush. She didn't carry a poster or a drawing like the others. She didn't need props. The silence that followed her was heavier than applause, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Andrew sat frozen, his pulse loud in his ears, his hands clasped together so tightly his knuckles whitened. Sophie reached the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and looked out at the crowd, but her eyes never searched for approval. They found him, and stayed there. "I didn't want to do this speech," she began, voice clear but soft. "When our teacher first gave the assignment, I thought, I don't have anyone I'm proud of. Not really. Not in the way other kids do." She paused, and the room remained utterly still. But then something strange happened. Someone came back. Someone who didn't have to. He wasn't there when I was born. He missed all the birthdays, the scraped knees, the science fairs. And yeah, part of me thought he came back out of guilt, or pity, or to prove something. But he didn't leave. When everything fell apart for him, when he lost the suits, the car, even his last name, he stayed. He started over right here. He fixed what he could with a hammer or a wrench, or sometimes just his hands. But more than that, he fixed things with silence, with presence, with showing up every day even when no one asked him to. Her voice wavered slightly but grew stronger. "This is Andrew Blake. He's not my biological dad, but he chose me, and I chose him back." A collective hush gripped the audience. Some adults blinked away tears. Andrew sat motionless, the words echoing louder in his chest than the claps that soon followed. In that moment, every ounce of loss, every harsh word, every sleepless night in the attic, every blister from painting fences and scrubbing gutters was worth it. Because the girl who had once looked him dead in the eyes and said he could never be her father had just declared in front of an entire town that she'd chosen him. And nothing could take that away. For a long moment, after Sophie's final words, the auditorium remained suspended in silence, as if time itself had stalled to absorb the weight of what had just been said. Teachers sat still in their rows, some dabbing at the corners of their eyes, while parents exchanged quiet, stunned glances. Even the children, usually squirming in their seats by this point in the school program, were hushed, sensing something different, something far deeper than a typical student presentation. On the far right of the second row, among the stiff blazers and polished shoes of Willow Creek's more affluent guests, sat Richard Blake Sr. Unmistakable in his tailored gray suit and gold cufflinks, the only hint of his Wall Street legacy in a town otherwise dressed in denim and cardigans. He had arrived late unannounced with no word to Andrew. And yet there he was, watching his son through narrowed eyes, not with admiration or support, but with the cold calculation of a man who had built his empire on power and pedigree. Richard had come expecting to witness his son's fall from grace firsthand, perhaps, to see him shamed in a town that could never match the prestige of Manhattan, perhaps to confirm that walking away from the Blake name had cost Andrew everything. But what he saw instead was a man stripped of armor, standing without title, without wealth, without a shred of the opulence he was raised in, yet beaming. Andrew was smiling. Not the rehearsed photo op smile Richard had taught him, but something raw and human and free. That smile, quietly received by the little girl who had just claimed him on stage, was not for business or legacy or approval. It was for belonging, for being chosen, for having stayed. And that to Richard was the true humiliation. Not the poverty, not the work clothes, not even the attic room above the bookstore, but the joy. The unbearable truth that Andrew had found something real in the very place Richard had deemed beneath them. And yet the old man kept his expression impassive, only the faintest shift in his jaw, betraying the fury curling behind his eyes. He sat through the applause with a stillness carved from decades of control. But he saw it all the way. The crowd leaned toward Andrew with warmth, the way children waved at him, the way Rachel's gaze lingered just a second longer. And for the first time, Richard Blake Sr. realized he had lost his son not to failure, but to something far more dangerous, a life that no longer needed his approval to feel full. After the ceremony, as families embraced and the hum of conversation returned to the auditorium, Richard Blake Sr. made his move. He waited until Andrew had stepped outside alone, lingering near the edge of the schoolyard where the oak trees cast long shadows over the grass. Richard approached with deliberate calm the way he always did when he was about to close a deal, but Andrew didn't flinch. He simply turned, met his father's gaze, and waited. "Andrew." Richard began, his voice low and clipped. "I'll restore everything. The penthouse, your accounts, the board seat, all of it. No questions asked." He stepped closer, each word coated in the same calculated charm he had used to manipulate men twice Andrew's intellect. "You've made your point fine. You've proven you can suffer nobly and get a few backwater townspeople to clap. But this," he gestured vaguely toward the school building, "this is temporary. You don't belong here. Come back, where you're meant to be." Andrew's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent. Richard took that as a sign of hesitation and pressed further. "I'm offering you your life back. Just walk away from this town, from this Rachel-fueled fantasy. You don't owe them anything, least of all those kids. They're not even yours." That last line lingered sharp as a blade, but Andrew didn't react the way Richard expected. He didn't lash out or crumble. Instead, he spoke with a quiet steadiness that cut far deeper than anger ever could. "She called me Dad," Andrew said. "Sophie, on that stage, in front of everyone. She chose me." His eyes locked with his father's. "And I chose her." Richard scoffed. "Children say foolish things. You really think that word means anything without the blood to back it?" Andrew stepped forward just enough that Richard had to tilt his chin slightly to maintain dominance. "Your granddaughter just called me Dad," he said again, softer this time, but with steel in his voice. "And that is something you can't buy back." Richard froze. For a man who had spent his entire life buying, acquiring, controlling, there it was, a truth he couldn't erase or outbid. Andrew turned and walked away without another word, leaving his father in silence, standing beneath the shadow of a school. He once thought beneath them all, defeated not by wealth, but by something it could never touch: love freely given. 1 year later, the once immaculately groomed Andrew Blake now woke up in a modest 3-bedroom cottage on the edge of Willow Creek, his hair a permanent mess of curls that refused to be tamed, and his shirt perpetually dusted with pancake flour or streaked with motor oil depending on the hour. Gone were the tailored suits, the sleek penthouse views, the endless calls from assistants confirming boardroom appointments. Now his mornings began before sunrise, when the air still smelled like dew and cinnamon, and the world felt quiet enough to hear himself think. He would stumble out of bed, Rachel's soft breathing still steady beside him, tiptoe past the creaky floorboard near the hallway that Maisie always claimed could hear secrets, and make his way into the tiny kitchen whose counters were always cluttered with school permission slips, cereal boxes, and jars of homemade jam they bought at the farmer's market every Saturday. By 6, he was already juggling a pancake pan in one hand and Eli's lunchbox in the other, humming off-key to whatever song Sophie had left playing on the Bluetooth speaker the night before. He always managed to burn at least one pancake, sometimes shaped vaguely like a dinosaur, sometimes unintentionally like a boot, and the kids had taken to rating his breakfasts on a scale from edible to tragic but brave. After breakfast, he'd kiss Rachel's temple as she sipped her coffee in her worn Mama Bear hoodie, then head out to the garage behind the house where Blake and Willow, his little repair shop named after his late mother, stood like a symbol of everything he had chosen to rebuild. He spent hours under the hood of trucks, sanding down chipped paint, tightening loose bolts, and laughing with customers who still found it surreal that a former corporate mogul now fixed taillights for a living. His hands, once smooth and manicured, were now calloused and stained, and he wore those scars like badges of honor. In the afternoons, he'd pick Maisie up from her art class and listen intently as she explained the emotions of color like a tiny professor. He'd stop by Eli's school to deliver his telescope book, or join him for a few quiet minutes of stargazing through the library windows. With Sophie, the connection was slower, still guarded, but she no longer flinched when he sat beside her at the table or offered to help fix the jammed paper tray in the ancient printer she now used for her essays. On Fridays, he took all 3 kids for milkshakes at the corner diner and watched them argue over flavors like it was a Supreme Court debate. The house itself was far from perfect, leaky faucet in the bathroom, a door that stuck when it rained, a back porch that tilted slightly left, but it breathed with life. Laughter echoed in its hallways, mismatched socks cluttered the laundry basket, and a welcome home sign, hand-painted by Maisie, hung crooked by the front door. Sometimes late at night, Andrew would sit alone on the porch steps, nursing a mug of terrible instant coffee, staring at the stars, and wondering how he had ever lived without this noise, this mess, this unfiltered joy. The man who once chased quarterly earnings now memorized Sophie's favorite poem, timed Eli's telescope sessions around moonrise, and carried Maisie on his shoulders when her little legs got tired during their Sunday walks. It wasn't easy. Some days the engine wouldn't start, or Rachel would glare at him for leaving a wrench on the counter, but it was real. And for the first time in his life, Andrew Blake knew what it meant to be full. Not with power, not with money, but with love, chaos, and 3 kids who now called him Dad without hesitation. It was a quiet Saturday morning, the kind of slow, golden hour that made the little kitchen in the cottage glow with warmth, sunlight bouncing off the chipped ceramic mugs and the stack of half-finished homework on the dining table. The smell of pancakes lingered in the air, mingling with the faint scent of motor oil from Andrew's flannel shirt, which he'd forgotten to change before coming inside to flip breakfast. Rachel was humming softly to herself, barefoot and content, as she washed a few dishes by the sink. Eli sat cross-legged on the floor by the back door, assembling something out of gears and cardboard, while Maisie sketched quietly in the sunlight near the window, tongue peeking out in concentration. Then came Sophie, confident, quiet, deliberate, holding a new drawing pressed close to her chest, like it held a secret too special to rush. She walked past Andrew without a word, stood in front of the refrigerator, and carefully smoothed a piece of tape along the top edge. The sound of it peeling off the roll caught his attention. He turned, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and stepped closer. And then he saw it. The drawing was simple, done in colored pencils, and the confident lines of a girl who had spent hours deciding how much to say without using words. 4 figures stood beneath a wide willow tree, Rachel, Maisie, Eli, and Sophie, all smiling. And beside them was Andrew, drawn with his wild curls, his uneven stubble, and his ever-present toolbox in one hand. The words at the top in Sophie's careful handwriting read, "Us and Daddy Andrew." For a second, he couldn't breathe. The quiet buzz of the fridge hummed beneath the silence, and somewhere in the distance a lawnmower droned across the neighbor's yard. But inside Andrew's chest, something cracked open, something deep and old and aching. Sophie, noticing his stillness, looked up at him, not seeking approval, not asking for permission, just watching. He reached out and gently traced the edge of the paper with one rough thumb, and then his voice came soft and full of something too big to hold back. I used to have everything he said mostly to himself. The skyline, the view, the title, the silence of a life no one touched. I had it all: money, power, a name that opened doors. He looked around the room, eyes lingering on each child, on Rachel, on the uneven floorboards and the cluttered countertops and the old radio humming in the background. But it wasn't until I lost all of it, he continued, that I found the one thing worth keeping. He turned fully toward Sophie, meeting her gaze, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as a father who had finally understood the price of presence. You gave me back more than I ever deserved. All of you did. Rachel said nothing but stepped closer and leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes misted with a quiet knowing. Maisie set down her pencil and walked over to point at her face in the picture. You see that smile? That's because of you, she said plainly. Then added, even if you still can't make pancakes without burning one. Eli looked up from his gear sculpture and offered Andrew a quiet nod, the kind that didn't need translation. And Sophie, still standing at the fridge, tilted her head. I didn't draw it because I felt sorry, she said softly. I drew it because it's true. Andrew crouched to meet her at eye level. I know, he whispered, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure it stays true. Outside, a breeze stirred the wind chimes on the porch. Inside, a drawing hung crookedly on the fridge door, taped next to a grocery list and a recipe Rachel had written in smudged blue ink. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't a boardroom. But to Andrew Blake, it was everything. And for the first time in years, he didn't want to be anywhere else. In the end, Andrew's journey reminds us of one of the most important truths in life. Success without love is hollow, and status without presence means nothing. We live in a world that often equates worth with wealth, where titles, cars, and corner offices are praised more than bedtime stories, burnt pancakes, and showing up for a child's school project. But real legacy isn't built in boardrooms. It's built in kitchens, classrooms, and quiet moments where we choose to stay even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs us everything we thought we needed. Andrew Blake had to lose his fortune to find his family, but what he gained was something no amount of money could ever buy: the trust of 3 children who finally believed someone wouldn't leave again. That kind of healing doesn't come from grand gestures. It comes from everyday presence, from learning how to fix a bike instead of a stock portfolio, from holding a paintbrush with a child instead of a pen with a lawyer. The lesson here is simple. Sometimes the richest life is the one that doesn't look impressive from the outside. So if you're chasing something that's pulling you away from the people who matter most, take a step back. Ask yourself what will still matter 10 years from now. Sometimes what you're truly meant to build isn't a company, it's a home. And sometimes the family you fight to be part of is the one that finally teaches you who you really are. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what part resonated with you the most. Don't forget to save this video so you can come back to it on hard days, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what truly matters. Let's keep building a world where presence is more powerful than prestige.